What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Awesemo channel, talking college football DFS. Before we get started, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content, including our live before locks, before all that goes live. And of course, head over to Awesemo, check out our college football package, everything you possibly need to dominate, projections, ownership, detailed slate write-ups, depth charts, everything you could possibly want. And we'll take you behind the glass today when we break down the slate, showing you some of our team data that is available on the site. And that brings me to it. We are talking the Saturday main slate. We will focus primarily on the DraftKings slate, but we have FanDuel available as well. They go into the night, so there's just more games to talk about. But we already have 12 with just DraftKings alone, so we will waste no time and dive right into this. One of our very first games is a premier one. It is Pittsburgh taking on Tennessee. And this might not seem like the best game to target for DFS at first glance, but both these teams play pretty fast and they play up-tempo football. In particular, on the Pitt side, you have an extremely pass-heavy, extremely fast team overall. Last year, this team was 18th in plays per game, 18th in pass rate. So this is a team we want to look at. Against Tennessee, they're a team that's completely rebuilding under Josh Heupel in their first season, so there's a chance to exploit this a little bit. For Pitt, you have a veteran signal caller in Kenny Pickett. He's efficient, completed 72% of his passes for 2 scores, 272 yards in week 1. Solid mobility, 39 rushing yards. His numbers last year were depressed because he suffered an ankle injury. He sprained his ankle, and then it completely erased his dual threat ability. But Pickett, somebody that we've used a lot in running situations. This team uses a 4-headed monster at running back, so you're probably not looking here. Vincent Davis led the team last year. He's the strong candidate to lead a committee, but you'll see Israel Abakanda, you'll see AJ Davis, you'll see Rodney Hammond, Daniel Carter. Not a strong target for DFS. But the pass game, you have a lot of good options. Jordan Addison's their alpha receiver. He plays in the slot, 60 catches, 666 yards last year. Paced the team with 8 targets in week 1. That's solid. Taysir Mack is your veteran option, 4,400. Saw 6 targets himself if you need a cheaper stack with Kenny Pickett. I think both of them make a lot of sense, and they also make sense solo if you're running Tennessee stacks. From there, no other wide receiver eclipsed 42% of the routes. So you're probably not taking guys like Jared Wayne or Shockey Jacques Louis, just too volatile. Lucas Krull did have 5 targets. He's their tight end. Maybe you use him as a really cheap option, but with Taysir Mack where he's priced 4,400, I think you just focus on Addison and Taysir for this game. On the Tennessee side, you saw them against Bowling Green in week 1. They dismantled them. Did not need to do a ton through the air, evidenced by Joe Milton's kind of poor numbers. He only completed 11 of 23 passes for 140 yards. And that's, man, against Bowling Green, seeing those numbers is concerning. Fortunately, Milton does have dual threat ability, 44 yards on the ground. This Heupel offense was number 1 in plays per game last year. They were very balanced to slightly above average in pass rate. That is the characteristics of a strong offense where we'd like to target the quarterback. Milton just hasn't shown a ton of upside so far. If he struggles, you could see Hendon Hooker, the Virginia Tech transfer, come in at any time. So I think Milton is somebody that is a little risky, but in GPPs, the offensive structure brings upside. Their backfield, Jabari Small, split way with Tyon Evans almost down the middle. Evans was a little more efficient, 121 yards to Small's 93. They will form a 50-50 committee, but something to watch here. Tyon Evans is rumored to be injured or dealing with COVID. Their coach, Heupel, has been very quiet on this issue. He basically just said that Evans is questionable. So you're going to have to watch him going into the game. If Evans is out, Jabari Small becomes one of the best players overall on the slate at 5,800. So just watch the status of Tyon Evans. In the receiver room, you had Cedric Tillman, Jalen Hyatt, and Javonte Payton playing a majority of the snaps. Each ran a route on at least 72% of dropbacks. Tillman led the group 93% of routes. Hyatt, he had 8 targets, 62 yards. Tillman actually had 6 targets, 48 yards, but again, Tillman running more routes. Payton was kind of a distant third. You could see him split more time with Velus Jones, who's getting over an injury. So Tillman's my favorite price-adjusted option at 5,300, Hyatt second. And that's really where I'm looking with Pitt and Tennessee. Spent a lot of time on this game because it is solid for DFS with that 57 total, which probably goes over, in my opinion, based on how these offenses both play. Game 2, we had to Tulsa taking on Oklahoma State. It's a 50.5 total. Oklahoma State, a 13.5 point favorite. Tulsa, not much to say here. Their applied team total is 18.5. So this is one you don't want to spend a lot of time on. Davis Brin has no mobility, racked up just 194 yards in their first game. Seth Boomer was hurt in their first game, so you could see him back at any point. Brin isn't someone to look at, doesn't really have job security. The running backs are Deneric Prince and Shamari Brooks. They'll split time basically 50-50. Prince should get a little more work. He rushed for 151 yards on 14 carries. Brooks, 80 yards on 10 carries. But Brooks is much, much cheaper. I'm probably not targeting either in this spot unless it's Brooks for salary savings, but there's better options. The receivers are pretty decent looks. You have them running 4 wide receivers in almost every single play. So Josh Johnson, Keelan Stokes, Sam Crawford, and Juan Carlos Santana. Last year, the pecking order was Stokes 1, Crawford 2, Santana 3. Johnson was banged up in the lineup. But you actually had Johnson 9 targets in their first game. And that is something to note because he's super cheap at 3,800. I think this is a situation where all 4 are viable. I'm looking to the really cheap guys in Juan Carlos Santana or Josh Johnson. I like Stokes at the top if you're going for an expensive option. And again, they're running 4 wide on most plays. Oklahoma State has a pretty good implied team total. The issue here is we don't know if Spencer Sanders is going to play. He was out the first game because of COVID-19 protocols. Shane Illingworth actually played really well in his stead. 40 pass attempts, over 300 yards, 44 rushing yards. Sanders is more dynamic as a dual threat. So I think if you're playing anyone in this game, Sanders makes a lot of sense, especially if he's healthy. You're going to get that rushing upside for him. In the run game, LD Brown, he was the better part of a committee featuring Jalen Warren, Utah State transfer. But LD Brown, this is his job to lose. 15 carries, 3 targets, only 29 yards. This Oklahoma State offensive line has been really inefficient now, going on 2 years. We saw this with Chuba Hubbard last year. But against Tulsa here, likely an uptick in efficiency, like LD Brown at his price. For the receivers, you have a couple transfers coming in. So Tylan Wallace is gone. Dylan Stoner's out. Tay Martin is a former Washington State transfer. He was with the team last year, but he was pretty decent in week 1, 107 yards, 10 targets. That led the team. He was followed by Bryson Green, 8 targets, only 41 yards. That's completely fine. As far as the third receiver, Brennan Presley and Braden Johnson, they are running about Presley 51% of their routes, Johnson 70. So I think you go to Johnson if you're trying to play the third wide receiver. He's 4K flat, which is really cheap. But at the same time, Bryson Green's 3,300, so there's no real reason to play either of them. Just go down to Green at 33 or up to Tay Martin at 69. And I think you can avoid most of the other pass catchers here. Oklahoma State's implied team total is very good at 32, so I do think you want to consider them. Opposed to Tulsa, maybe you're getting one of the cheap receivers, but probably not much. South Carolina taking on East Carolina, 57 total. This spread opened -2 in favor of East Carolina. It's now flipped towards South Carolina. Luke Doty's been practicing, so maybe we'll see him play. That would just take Zeb Noland out of play. Noland, South Carolina didn't have to use anyone in their first game, so it's tough really to decide anything from them. But Noland was pretty efficient. If you don't see Doty, you'll see him. There's a decent total, so maybe you could look to Noland and stacks. The running back room, Kevin Harris has been practicing this week. He was their leading rusher last year. Marshawn Lloyd, Juju McDowell, and Zaquandre Wright all formed a committee without him, but Harris should lead this backfield when healthy. There's a chance they ease him into action, so Harris is probably just a GPP option. He's still 7,500, which is really expensive. In the receiving room, Jalen Brooks, Josh Vann, and DeKurian Joyner were the top 3 targets. You had Brooks 18 yards on 3 targets, Vann 2 targets for 27 yards. He ran the second most routes, and Joyner was third. But Joyner clearly has a role in the offense. They got him involved in the run game, 3 carries. That's your pecking order. Unfortunately, none of them are super, super cheap. I think if you're looking at one of the really cheap guys, you're probably just going to play a Josh Vann. But I don't love these players and their prices. They're contrarian stacks for tournaments. ECU still has a pretty decent implied team total here. It's up at 27.5 points, so some back and forth, at least intrigue to this game. Holton Hilaris has disappointed since his freshman year. He's a multi-year starter now. He had 41 attempts, 295 yards, which is fairly efficient as a passer. But what we don't like is he just isn't running anymore. His rushing yards have dropped every season since his freshman year, just 14 yards in week 1. There's a chance he regains this upside, but we just haven't seen it, and they're trying to use him as a pocket passer. He only completed 55% of his passes, so that's not his game. You'd hope they'd go back to the rushing upside, but that makes him just a GPP play. ECU doesn't run the ball, so they're not really options in the run game, especially when their lead rusher, Rajai Harris, is 5,500, 6,300 on FanDuel. Not an option. In the past game, you have two clear leaders in CJ Johnson and Tyler Snead. Johnson actually led Tyler Snead. He out-targeted him 7-6. The receiving yards, they were pretty poor on both sides. CJ Johnson, 34, Tyler Snead, 26. The third receiver was a split between Audie Omotosho and Cy Hatfield, neither of whom are particularly strong options. I think you just go up and play CJ Johnson here. And I have mild interest in stacking this game, but I think it will be contrarian just because of the teams that you have in the game. South Carolina, ECU, not your premier programs. Oregon taking on Ohio State. This is one of the premier real-life matchups. The total 63.5, so it is the best total we've talked about so far, even though I think Pitt, Tennessee is a chance. Points. Anthony Brown, not a dynamic passer, but he's a fine rusher, 56 yards there. Gets a tougher matchup here against Ohio State. Ohio State was fairly giving in their first game, but it primarily came on pure volume alone. Their 203 rushing yards allowed came on 50 carries. So that's only 4.1 yards per attempt. Their defense actually more efficient than what these numbers, raw numbers, indicate. Don't love Anthony Brown for that reason. It's a really tough match for him, for a guy that's struggling throwing the ball. Their run game is a 50-50 split between Verdell and Dye. I think there's just better options in these price ranges. You don't need to take a 14.5-point underdog against a strong Ohio State defense. The receiver room is tough. We didn't get honesty out of Oregon in week 1. You had Troy Franklin listed as a clear starter, but only played 16 snaps. It was revealed after the game that Franklin sustained an injury in practice, causing the limited snaps. He was their high-profile 4-star recruit. He should play when healthy, and he was listed as a starter. His injury allowed Chris Hudson, who was actually listed as a third-teamer, to get significant run. You can see the dishonesty from the Oregon program. Micah Pittman and Josh Johnson were the other two starters. They were actually used in this capacity. Pittman and Johnson each ran a run at 73% of the dropbacks. Pittman led the team with 40 yards on 5 targets. Again, this isn't a good matchup. Ohio State returned 7 of their top 8 defensive backs from last year. It's not a spot where we're going to try to get too cute and play these guys. I think if you're going to play any of them, it's Micah Pittman, cheapest one. On Ohio State, man, frustratingly, hopefully you got the spread at 13.5 because they pushed at 14. This team had wild success running the ball against Minnesota and then abandoned the run game to try to get the ball in their new signal caller C.J. Stroud's hands, with limited success until the second half when you just saw Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave running wide up and down the field. But this team should have relied on the run. I think they should do the same here. But they will form a 3-man committee at running back. Mayan Williams, Master Teague, and even Marcus Crowley at 6 carries. Trevion Henderson only 2. This, at the very least, is going to be 3, maybe 4 men, which is really tough to see, especially with Mayan Williams being as efficient as he was, 125 yards. And then you had Master Teague, Marcus Crowley. They've been nothing but inefficient through their entire careers. So for Ryan Day to continue to commit resources to them is frustrating, but it's going to happen. Makes all of them really dicey GPP plays. C.J. Stroud's commanding one of the better skill position groups in college football. So while he struggled a little bit himself, he, of course, had the turnovers, completion percentage fairly low, but Stroud still 294 passing, 4 touchdowns. That's going to happen when you have Olave and Wilson. Between the two, I'm always trying to target the cheaper one because they're essentially the same play. They didn't have a ton of passing volume in their first game. Wilson, 11 targets, Olave, 6. As we saw last year, that very easily could flip. And Olave actually finished with more receiving yards. I prefer Wilson based on price, but both phenomenal plays. I'll be playing a lot of Garrett Wilson this week just based on his price. He's a phenomenal price-adjusted play. Next game, we have Florida taking on USF. It is a wide spread, 29 points in favor of the Gators. The total overall is just 58, but you still have Florida coming in with a massive implied team total because they are huge favorites. Florida used 2 quarterbacks in their last game. Emory Jones started. He played a majority of the game, but Anthony Richardson did mix in, and this was not just in blowout time. Anthony Richardson played a bit in the first half. It was tough. Emory really disappointed as a passer, but he has some job security here. He should get the nod again. Again, Jones, 63% completion percentage, just 4.2 yards per attempt, 1 score, 2 interceptions. Both of these guys are elite dual threats, which is what keeps them in play. Emory Jones, 74 yards. Anthony Richardson, 160. Both are playable based on that. They're both only GPP options to me because there is no job security, and you'll see them both play today. It's tough to trust. In the running back room, Malik Davis, 5,600, 14 carries, 106 yards. But Damian Pierce, 6 carries himself, 31 yards. DeMarcus Bowman, 4 carries. They're going to use a running back by committee, even if you have Davis leading it. Bowman, he was a really distant third option, so I think it's basically just Malik Davis and Dameon Pierce. Davis, for whatever reason, is cheaper than Pierce, which doesn't make sense. So in GPPs, I think you can look to them both. Preference to Davis. I'll be playing him in tournaments, not cash. He also had a decent amount in the pass game. They both did. Among the receivers, Rick Wells actually led them in targets, but he did not lead them in routes run, which was really interesting. He only ran a route on 32% of the dropbacks, still had 5 targets. For reference, Copeland, 52% of the routes. Whittemore, 55. Justin Shorter, he's in the 50s too. Florida typically runs a rotation. Again, in their first game, they were dismantling FAU, 3-touchdown game. So maybe this narrows a little bit, but you're still going to see a lot of rotating. I think Whittemore at 4K makes the most sense of the group, followed by like the Shorters and the Copelands. USF, 14.5-point total. No job security among the quarterbacks. I think Timmy McClain probably gets a start based on his performance and Cade Fortin's terrible performance. Running back by committee, not worth targeting. The receivers, they listed 6 as starters to begin the year, but they actually narrowed that a little bit. You had Weaver running the most routes among the trio, led the team with 10 targets, 73 yards. He's the best option. Latrell Williams comes in second, 5 targets, -5 yards. And then Bryce Miller actually ran the most routes. So Bryce Miller, those are your top 3. And none of them are particularly interesting. They're all between like $3.5 and $4,500. There's better options. But if you're running some sort of run back for your stacks, I would put them in order: Xavier Williams, Bryce Mitchell, Latrell Williams. Rutgers taking on Syracuse, 52.5 total. Not great. Rutgers, they're hovering between 1.5, 2.5-point favorites. It keeps moving back and forth, but they dismantled Temple in their first game. You have Nova Draw, strong dual threat quarterback. He did not play the whole game because of blowout, not because of benching, so he has job security. Good rusher, 58 yards on the ground, only 132 passing on 28 attempts. Passing is not his strength, but luckily they typically keep his ADOT pretty low, giving the receivers yard after catch opportunity, and Syracuse certainly doesn't scare you. Syracuse knocked off Ohio in their first game, just for referencing their statistics. Rutgers, in the run game, they will use Isaiah Pacheco as their lead back. He carried 14 times, very inefficient for him, just 35 yards on the ground. This Rutgers run game may struggle, and he was complimented early in the game by Aaron Young. It's going to be a 1A, 1B for them. The receivers I'm more interested in, you have Bo Melton. He still looks like the alpha, turned a leading 6 targets into 58 yards. Aaron Crookshanks, your slot receiver, 7 targets, 24 yards, 4,400 for Crookshank. He's going to get those easy yard after catch type opportunities, but Melton more upside used downfield. Sanders was their third receiver, but no other receiver outside of Crookshank and Melton ran a route on 35% of the dropbacks. So trying to get to Melton and Crookshank. Vidral, I'm somewhat interested in stacks because of the dual threat ability. Probably a single stack with him. On Syracuse, they whipped up on Ohio, barely threw the ball. Tommy DeVito got the start over Garrett Schrader, ripped to me. Not very efficient, just 92 yards for Tommy DeVito. 49 rushing yards. He's somewhat mobile. Typically, that's a little higher than what we've seen out of DeVito in the past. He'll take a lot of sacks, which will be more of a problem here against this Rutgers team, who's pretty strong up front. Rutgers recruits fairly well. They're a top 50 recruiting team in the country. In the run game, they committed fully to Sean Tucker. 25 carries for him, 181 yards. Again, he's going to have more trouble today, but Tucker's still a bell cow back. 6,800 is completely fine for him as a 2.5-point underdog. You could get to Tucker. The receivers in order are going to be Taj Harris, Anthony Quealy, Sherrod Johnson, just like we saw in the first game. They just did not pass a ton, so you have Taj Harris dominating targets. Quealy should be second. Johnson should be third. It's what we saw in targets. It's what we saw in routes run. And trying to get to Quealy really cheap or just up to Taj Harris if I'm playing this Syracuse team. And Taj makes a lot of sense. He's a dude that dominated targets last year for this team. Sometimes inefficient, but again, a close projected game here. Taj is a solid play. Toledo taking on Notre Dame. Toledo is implied for 19.5 points. They're 17-point underdogs to the Irish in a 56 total. Toledo was not in a competitive game in their first contest. As we saw, they handled Norfolk State 49-10, and we've seen a lot of these MAC teams get dismantled in week 1. The MAC teams played a MAC-only schedule last year, and a lot of them are being overrated. We even saw in the previous game, Syracuse dismantle Ohio, a team that was the second favorite team to lead that conference and potentially win it. So Notre Dame comes in significantly undervalued against their close tilt at Florida State. They are going to run 2 quarterbacks at Toledo. DeQuan Finn is a fantastic dual threat, 82 yards. Carter Bradley's more your passer. They'll be used situationally. I'm not interested in either because of the split. Otherwise, I typically am. Toledo's fairly efficient offense, but you can't play either with the split. Bryant Koback is going to be the leader of this backfield. Again, they just crushed Norfolk State, so you didn't really get to see what their backfield is truly looking like. Koback should lead it. Micah Kelly carried the ball the second most times, but he didn't enter the game into the second half. So Jaquez Stewart is actually the handcuff probably to Koback, but not targeting Koback at his price, not targeting any of the backs behind him. In the receiving room, Toledo typically uses a nasty rotation. Bryce Mitchell and Isaiah Winstead are listed as co-starters with Denzel Mackenzie Lewis and Jerwan Newton. The only individual starter is Devin Maddox. And then you had Mackenzie Lewis leading the team in route rate, 71%. Everyone else hovered around 50%. The only wrinkle here is that Mitchell was ejected for an unsportsmanlike conduct, so maybe his snaps were a little lower. If you're running back someone on Toledo, it's probably Mitchell, in my opinion. On Notre Dame, we actually saw a lot out of Jack Cohn. A little surprising to me, but he passes for 366 yards. He's not mobile whatsoever, so he's going to rely on his arm. But Notre Dame has been a fairly efficient offense, and this goes back a ways now when we look at just the offense overall. They've been very adapt to their quarterback. So they run heavier under Book, look like they're going to go pass heavier under Cohn. Their offensive coordinator is Tommy Rees. He's a sharp dude. Last year, their pass rate, 43%. It jumped to 52% in the first game. So liking what Notre Dame is doing with Cohn. He's 8,900, which is too much for a guy that's not mobile whatsoever. He's going to have to get there through efficiency. And we have seen Notre Dame just run the ball when they're playing from ahead. So that's a concern for me. I think I would like to get elsewhere, but in tournaments, the implied total is enough to take stabs on Cohn in stacks. Kyron Williams, he is going to be the leading rusher for the second straight year. 7,300 is a bargain for him. 18 carries, 42 yards. Typically, you're seeing more efficiency from Kyron. And even if you don't, 6 targets, 17% target share. This dude's a phenomenal pass catcher. So he's involved in multiple parts of the game. Love Kyron as a play. Michael Mayer saw about a 3K jump in price. He's 7,400, led the team with 13 targets, 120 yards, alpha receiver. Kevin Austin was their second most utilized. He's their actual receiver. We have Mayer playing tight end. Austin, he led the team, but he didn't lead the team in snaps. That was actually Avery Davis, who wasn't targeted. So I think if you're playing a cheap guy, it's Davis. If you're playing an expensive guy, it's Austin or Mayer. Braden Lenzy's kind of in the middle of both. Lenzy, only 4 targets, 39 yards. I think you just go down and play Davis, or you pay Austin paying up. But I think getting a piece of Notre Dame makes sense. Next game is UAB taking on Georgia. 24.5-point spread for Georgia. UAB has a 10-point total. You're not targeting UAB. Tyler Johnson, not the most mobile, some mobility. This is a run-heavy, really slow UAB team. Not interested in really anyone. They run a committee at running back. Their receivers aren't strong. No one more than 5 targets in the first game. They're not worth spending a lot of time on. You even had DJ Uiagalelei for Clemson unable to move the ball on Georgia's elite defense. Don't play UAB. On the other side, JT Daniels, not mobile whatsoever. Very efficient as a passer. Struggled in the first game against Clemson. That's going to be the toughest game they play all year outside of maybe the SEC championship, at least in the regular season schedule. Clemson, the best team they'll face. So brighter days are ahead for JT Daniels. It's just a matter of, as 24.5-point favorites, did they need to use him here? I tend to think not, and he's a negative in the run game. So Daniels kind of off the board for me, especially with all their pass catchers hurt, as we'll get to. They run upwards of 5 running backs at times. We saw 4 in the last game. Zamir White, the most efficient by far, 74 yards on the ground to 20 for Milton, to 19 for Cook, to 5 for McIntosh. Doesn't matter. Kirby Smart runs multiple backs no matter what to prevent transfers, even at the cost of potentially winning games. White's too expensive for me, but there's a path to his ceiling if he's the one that scores all the touchdowns. But I think in games where you're playing with a lead, you see more mixes of Milton, Cook, and McIntosh. Tough to trust the Georgia backs. The receivers are absolutely dismantled right now. You have Eric Gilbert away from the team. Darnell Washington undergoing foot surgery in the spring. Not going to be back for a few weeks. George Pickens, torn ACL. Dominic Blaylock, returned to practice, but still rehabbing his torn ACL. Uncertain game status here, didn't play in week 1. Jermaine Burton even played limited snaps after missing most of camp to an injury. That a lot of opportunities for Marcus Rosemead. Jack Saint, 5,500, ran the most routes, 84%. Burton at 69. Burton still a lot of targets for him to go around, especially moving forward. Just 2 in the first game, 11 yards. Again, didn't play a full complement of snaps. I think brighter days are ahead for Burton. Jack Saint, only 2 targets on his 84% of routes. That's a little tough to trust. Brock Bowers, their tight end, he stepped up a lot for not having Gilbert, not having Washington. He actually ran around in 72% of dropbacks, led the team with 6 targets. He's 3,600, so just a pure punt play you could definitely look to is Brock Bowers. Their third receiver was Ladd McConkey. He only ran around on 47% of dropbacks. He's going to get squeezed by a wide receiver rotation, and Georgia running a lot of 12 personnel. So if I'm playing a receiver, it's probably going to be Brock Bowers, the tight end, or looking at somebody like Jermaine Burton in GPPs, assuming he's healthier. Jack Saint kind of just that middling option. But Georgia, a little tough to get to with their lower implied team total, slow-paced game, really low total overall. Mainly looking at Zamir White in tournaments, but don't even love that from the running back rotation. A couple games left. Cal taking on TCU, another really low game, 48 points, 11.5 points in favor of TCU. Cal was an absolute disaster in week 1. I don't know what Justin Wilcox is doing. He's certainly in the hot seat now. He's made a bunch of really bad decisions, including hiring Bill Musgrave as their play caller, who continues to just trot out Chase Garbers. They lost to Nevada last week. You can't deal with that as a Pac-12 school and one that's supposed to be good. Garbers is horrific. He completed 25 of 38 passes, 177 yards, 1 score, 1 interception, some mobility, but he's just your definition of a game manager. TCU is a step up in competition from Nevada as well. Don't like Garbers. Damian Moore actually led the backfield. He'll split time with Marcel Dancy to a degree, but Damian Moore, 15 carries, 79 yards, 4 targets. That's pretty good. You just don't like targeting a team with such a low total. I would say Moore is an option in GPPs. Nico Remigio led the team with 8 targets, only managed 17 yards, but outside of Remigio, tight end Jake Tongs was the second leading route runner, 85% of the routes for him. He's 3,700, not playing anyone on Cal. TCU, you have veteran signal caller Max Duggan back for his 3rd year as the starter. The TCU Horned Frogs didn't have to show anything. They played Duquesne in week 1, so you barely saw Duggan at all. 19 pass attempts for him, 209 yards, very efficient. Great mobility for Duggan. Didn't have to see it in week 1, but we know he's a very good dual threat. He's 8,800. It's a little expensive for this game environment, but Dugan's viable, even naked because of his rushing upside. TCU uses 4 running backs. You're not playing any of the forwards. DeMarco Foster, Kendry Miller, Zach Miller, Amari DeMercado. None are options. The receiver room, you had a changing of the guard a little bit. Quentin Johnston is still their number 1, 5,100. 7 targets, 38 yards receiving. You can play him in more competitive matchups. I'm fine if you want to take a shot on him in tournaments. Savon Williams was the second receiver, actually ran the second most routes, followed by Quincy Brown. TCU has a history of an annoying wide receiver rotation, but Johnston and Williams look like the safest options for now. Former starters Tay Barber and J.D. Spielman were benched. Tay Barber, 8% of routes, J.D. Spielman, 20% of routes. And again, they played Duquesne, so there's some noise here. But Johnston, their wide receiver run, 64% of routes. This does not bode well for Tay Barber and J.D. Spielman. You can ignore them moving forward. Next game, Texas A&M, Colorado, another middling total, 50 points. Texas A&M a 17-point favorite. You saw really up and down play from Haynes King in their first game. He was actually efficient as a passer, 292 yards, completed 64%, pair of scores. The issue is he threw 3 interceptions, so he's got to complete some of these passes, be a little better with his decision-making. Fantastic dual threat, which we saw flashes of, 22 yards for King. There were just flashes of brilliance overall, marred by a few avoidable turnovers. So hopefully, as non-con goes on, we can see better play from King. Think the job security is still there for him. He's 8,300 on DraftKings, which is certainly affordable enough to take shots on in tournaments because of the dual threat ability. I have interest in King. Veteran running back Isaiah Spiller led the team, 17 carries, 113 yards, also 3 targets. He's going to be a solid play at 6,700. Devon Akane, change of pace, but still 124 yards for him. It's Spiller's job for the most part. He's the 1A to Akane's 1B, and they're close enough in price where I'm just getting to Spiller. The wide receiver room, you have former running back Anai Smith in the slot, 7,600. He is going to be complemented by Chase Lane and Caleb Chapman. Smith led the team with 10 targets, 100 yards. Chapman turned his 6 targets into 91 yards. Lane, 41 yards on 6 targets. But even athletic tight end Jalen Weidermeyer was involved, second on the team in targets with 8. This is a narrow target distribution between these 4. My favorite plays are either going all the way up to Anai Smith or all the way down to Weidermeyer, who's the cheapest of the bunch at $5K. And again, second overall in targets here. Colorado is going to be tough to trust. Didn't really get a good look at Colorado in week 1, playing Northern Colorado, but Brendan Lewis, only 16 attempts. Again, they just didn't use him. Good dual threat for Lewis, 44 yards rushing. They're only implied for 16.5 points. I'm probably not getting to Lewis, but he is one of the cheaper dual threats. I think that's viable on the slate. So maybe if you're just doing a punt option in one of your super flex, you go to Lewis. Running back room, Jarek Broussard led the team, 15 carries, complemented by Alex Fontenot, 8, Ashad Clayton, 8. I think Broussard leads the backfield this year. We have a situation where Broussard was the only man in town last year. Fontenot was hurt. That elevated some of Jarek Broussard's attempts. I think he is in more of a timeshare this year. They are 17-point underdogs. Broussard is a good pass catcher, but I'm not sure how much of him you want at 7K. Isaiah Spiller, for reference, is just 300 cheaper. I'd rather have him 100% of the time. They didn't throw the ball at all in week 1. Now, Dimitri Stanley, 1 target. Don't be fooled. He's their wide receiver 1, 5K for him. If you're looking for a run back, it's Stanley. Their other receiver, Brendan Rice, wasn't even targeted, but he also ran the second most routes. It's Stanley, it's Rice, then it's some combination of Levante Chenault and Daniel Arias. Not interested a ton in Colorado. 2 games left. Ball State taking on Penn State. 58 total here, fairly good. 58 total, a 23-point spread in favor of Penn State. Ball State, you have Drew Plitt, another MAC team. And again, these MAC teams haven't faced very good competition lately. Drew Plitt isn't the most mobile quarterback. He relies a lot on his arm, and he's facing a huge jump in competition against Penn State here. Plitt is not somebody I really want to look at much, but in large field tournaments, he's potentially an option just because Ball State runs so many plays. They're 8th in plays per game last year. Rather than target Pitt, I think the better approach would be to use one of his receivers as a run back because you have such a clear and narrow target distribution between Justin Hall and Johannes Tyler. 11 targets for Hall, 8 for Johannes Tyler. I'm more interested in Tyler just because of the price. $4,200, he makes a cheap run back in your Penn State stacks. And again, target share, 41% for Justin Hall, 29.5% for Tyler. Comfortable with either. Ja'Shawn Jackson's a distant third. I'm not trying to get to him. Just get up to Tyler. Running back room, Will Jones is going to lead the way. Somewhat efficient, 93 yards and 18 carries. Carson Steele's change of pace. Not trying to get to too much of the runners. On Penn State, a team that just embraced so many pass-first approaches under their new offensive coordinator, Yurcich, who comes over from Texas. Sean Clifford dealt with some accuracy issues, but still ends up with 247 yards on 33 attempts. Overall, he completed I don't have the completion percentage in front of me. His accuracy was an issue at times throughout the game, but we like Sean Clifford because of his dual threat ability too. Only 5 yards rushing in the first game, but this is something that's been a strength of him throughout his career. It's a pretty modest price for this game environment where Ball State plays up-tempo. You have Penn State implied for 40.5 points, and Ball State, very giving. They allow 295 passing yards per game. So like Clifford, easy stacking options with Jahan Dotson. He's the alpha, over 100 yards on 10 targets in their last game. Parker Washington's their second receiver, 6 targets. He turned that into 47 yards. Keandre Lambert-Smith, he turned 5 targets into 71. Those are the clear 1, 2, 3 in the pass game. Noah Cain is also an option as a big favorite here. He only saw 8 carries in week 1 because Penn State basically turned to a pass-first approach, but nobody else really rivaled him at all in the backfield. 8 carries, 6 targets for Noah Cain. If they're playing with positive game script, there's a lot of upside for him in tournaments. I do think you maybe see Kevon Lee and Devin Ford mix in a bit more in those situations, but upside for sure with Noah Cain. Like Clifford, a decent amount in tournaments as well. Last game is one to forget. 46-point total. It's Iowa taking on Iowa State. Iowa State, a 4.5-point favorite. Neither team is efficient. Iowa State, Iowa. The Hawkeyes run a really run-heavy, slow-paced scheme. Spencer Petras is a horrible quarterback. He can't throw. He can't run. I'm not sure they'd be better off putting a running back out there and running some sort of, triple option offense. That's basically what they do anyway, except they have 10 men on the field with Petras not really being a threat. He can't run. The minuscule total, you're not looking at Petras. Their run-heavy approach, conversely, does make Tyler Goodson a pretty good play on a weekly basis. 19 carries for 99 yards, saw 3 targets in the pass game. Goodson, 7,100. I'd still rather get to guys like Spiller, but he's in play. The pass catchers, because you don't like Petras, you're probably not playing any of these guys. Laporta is their best receiver. He's actually a tight end, turned 8 targets into 83 yards. Tyrone Tracy and Charlie Jones were the next most active pass catchers, but not trying to play much of Iowa. On the other side, in annual tradition, Iowa State struggles against lower-level competition in their first game. That was the case against Northern Iowa in week 1. Coaching staff has a lot of trouble evaluating what their team should be doing. Makes sense. You'd want to run the ball against Northern Iowa, except they didn't have any success with that. Breece Hall, 23 attempts, 70 yards, and allegedly he was banged up into the game. So smashing your injured running back 23 times into the back of your offensive line for an inefficient 70 yards doesn't make a lot of sense, especially when Purdy was being efficient. Purdy put up 58 yards rushing on the ground. He completed 21 of 26 passes for 199 yards, only 5 incompletions for Purdy all day. Not sure why they didn't use him more as a passer. Purdy, he's a veteran. He has good dual threat ability. This is just a tough game environment to target him. Receivers, you have Xavier Hutchinson. He's going to be the leader. 8 targets for him, 88 yards. Tariq Milton's back from injury after missing most of last year. He's more of a burner. 4 targets, 31 yards for him. You also had Charlie Kolar missing week 1. He's 4,600. So if you're seeing Charlie Kolar active and you're not playing Hutchinson, I'd rather just go down and play him. He'll be your top play overall. But that is your slate. If you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment. Let me know. We will be back with Live Before Locks, not only before the main slate, but the Friday slate as well. Anytime there's big college football slates, you can count on us being there for Live Before Locks. Check out Awesemo, see all the tools we have to offer. Before we head out, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe. Make sure to hit the notification bell so you know when this and all our content goes live. I'm Matt Gajewski on Twitter, @Matt_Gajewski. We will see you guys again next time.